So we've talked a lot about energy transition and energy security. Ajay, you mentioned it earlier that that's become an issue this year as the Russian-Ukraine situation's evolved. How has that impacted the conversation around this current energy transition?
Yeah, so prior to the war, I think there was a significant amount of momentum behind transitioning to green energy sources, wind and solar. And the conversation almost became either this or that between fossil fuels and clean energy.
Yeah. At all costs, we're going to do this.
Correct. Yeah. And that's where you saw a lot of incentives coming out from a government standpoint. You're seeing a lot of investment being deployed from a green energy standpoint. And then post Russia-Ukraine war, I think we had a really good conversation start coming about between energy diversification and not either or. And so now we're thinking about a mix of energy sources to meet energy demand, not a strict transition from one to the other. And I think that's where this energy security narrative has really helped create this kind of pragmatic conversation now within the energy space of how do I appropriately transition or transform energy sources in a way that I'm still meeting energy demand and I'm also supplying reliable, affordable sources of energy, which is always going to have to include fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So I see it as we're on two timelines here. So you're talking short term, you're talking this winter. It's crisis mode, right? So it's BTUs available into Europe in particular. And I think you characterize it very well, which is, I think the high level of ideological sort of posturing has sort of abated a bit. And I think we're in a place of, both what other energy sources are available, but also what other types of tools do companies and policymakers have to manage energy balances. Things like curtailments, commercial and industrial demand getting cut so residential demand can be sort of maintained. I think those are all things that we're going to see quite a bit of. But I think as you go into the medium term, it becomes a much, I think, almost more aggressive or more supportive discussion around energy transition. I think AJ mentioned this earlier. I think the momentum is there once we move out of probably the winter. We'll see how long in 2023 this lasts as well, to say, well, the system created a reliance that was unsustainable. So there's more interest for exploration of more and different types of products, distributed power generation to get away from, centralized natural gas delivered by pipelines from Russia, for example. I think the other piece that we see that's super interesting about this period in time right now is the run-up in conventional energy prices means that you can actually justify the investment, not in all cases, but in many cases, on a standalone basis for energy transition or low carbon fuels or decarbonized technologies in a way that you would have never been able to do before. We talked about capturing fugitive emissions and lowering methane intensity. Well, you're getting paid a lot per MMBTU of every MMBTU of gas that you're recovering now and putting back into the system and monetizing. You're able to justify, biofuels or maybe e-fuel type investments that wouldn't have been able to really stand on an economic basis previously because your replacement costs have come so high. I think that creates a really interesting dynamic moving, past this year and past this immediate crisis for what kind of new sources of supply technologies can be on the market in a couple of years.
I hear some folks argue that yes, this crisis has pushed on the accelerator, that we need to transition even faster. But I still think it's the transformation or evolution bucket. You got to really look at the base load, making sure it's secure and certainly affordable and reliable. And as we layer on new technologies, making sure that those meet some of those criteria as well. And some technologies will work better in different places. And as I talk about base load, it could mean turning back on nuclear, and so that can provide a very reliable base load. And so I think it will be a lot of technology, and as we develop new fuels and find ways to enable some of these new, whether it's the blue products that Talos is interested in helping to enable, or even as we talked about some of the renewable fuels. When you think about whether it's biodiesel or renewable natural gas, there's a lot of great things that do make economic sense today that maybe didn't a few years ago, and I think that's very exciting and just really allows us to continue to innovate and rethink how how we approach and use various products and even processes.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with those statements. Just to use a crude football analog, it's you got to catch the ball first before you can run, with it. So that's what I would say is security first, before sustainability. But that said, I think although there's some headwinds, from the European crisis, the one thing I would also say is I think there's a lot of momentum going into it. I think it's still there. And I would say that, you need, like Robin mentioned, you need a mix of these sources. And then over time, it just have to, continue to increase the percentage of the renewable sources and decrease the reliance on fossil fuels. But until you do that, the fossil fuels do play a role in the energy mix.
I think if you look at what the IRA, for example, has, right, in the middle of an energy crisis where we pass this large green energy bill, functionally, it's hydrogen, yes, it's solar, but it's also very supportive for carbon capture and blue economy, which functionally is a hydrocarbon extender. And I think it's very pragmatic in terms of the way that you can debate the pros and cons of specific packages or specific payment terms that are built into that bill, but ultimately it's about buying down front-end cost to make a whole host of different types of lower carbon technologies available to the consumer. And I think it's more pragmatic in the sense that it's not prescriptive around technology or process. It's prescriptive around carbon density.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think of decarbonization of large industrials and they think the power sector, but it's plastics, it's cement, it's steel, which everything you look around and use and touch and feel and use every day comes from those elements. So the more we can decarbonize those systems, I think the better off everyone will be. So it'll be not only introducing new fuels, but just being smarter and creating ever greener fuels and products along the way too.
And I think the U.S. was in a pretty good position being more of a fast follower to what was happening in the UK and the EU. And you saw what the ramifications of trying to accelerate too quickly because you were focused on shifting to those green energy sources. And then you start seeing the price inflation for fossil fuels. You're not meeting the energy demand. So then you're kicking back on coal facilities, and then you're not necessarily innovating. You're kind of taking steps back that you've tried to accelerate too quickly. And you look at Germany, I think they came out and they had plans to decommission their nuclear facilities. And now with the conversation, they're keeping those as backup. So there's been a little bit of a too fast of an acceleration from a short midterm perspective that we really need to be thinking through. And I think the IRA somewhat indicated a little bit of that need for that diversification mix, because part of it was opening up the lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico as well. So there was a kind of recognition of fossil fuels coupled with large-scale decarbonization on CCS, while also continuing to push for advancement in that renewable technology to where it does become somewhat more of a cost substitute energy source. Then we focus on solving some of that reliability issue in the future.
And that's even going on in Europe, right? The UK has recently reversed its ban on fracking. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, it's not an instant solution. That's not going to lead to more gas production this winter. But how are the people going to feel about that? Does anybody?
Yeah, and we're certainly not perfect here either. I mean, having reflected back on Winter Storm Uri in February of 21, even here in, I'll call the great state of Texas, we faced our own challenges. And so I really feel for really all of Europe right now, knowing going into, if it's a cold winter, it could be a very big struggle, even though we had a few days without power and had some very extreme situations there. It's going to be even more extreme. And I hate that it comes to that, but I think at least folks are starting to open their minds a little more to realizing it's going to take a lot of solutions to help tackle this. And energy is important. It's everything we use every day. I always try to, as I'm talking to even investors, is remind folks, every other sector needs and relies on the energy sector every day. So it's so important. And I think we're so so advantaged and so used to it here in the United States. We often take it for granted until you have one of those instances like Winter Storm Uri, and you realize, wow, this is a huge deal, and it's life-threatening in many cases. And when you think about a winter storm like that in Europe, where it's much colder, it's frankly terrifying. And I hope we get some solutions in place before it gets any worse.
No, I think you brought up a really good point. And one is the conversations that you have in a setting like this or in the boardroom, right? The other one is the consumers, right? So there's two things. One is who's going to pay for it, right? The cost, maybe as technologies advance and it becomes more widely available, the cost of that comes down. I was just talking to my brother who lives, him and his family live in Germany. They were trying to charge their electric car with a completely renewable, 100% renewable, source of power. And it was 65 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yeah. Wow.
There are people who can afford that, can do it. But then, as these costs increase, who's going to pay that? Especially with everything going on now. So that's one thing that, is definitely, to keep in mind. The other one is, like you said, it's also in a way, it's a safety issue as well, like what happened in Uri, in 2021. And just a funny anecdote. So when we moved into our new house, we had a fully plumbed natural gas generator in our house. And I was like, this is Texas, nothing happens, Why do I even need it? It just, it looks hideous in my backyard, right? Fast forward 2021, we had the storm and it kicked in. So, we had power.
Yep.
So, I think it just goes back to say that, you definitely need to have a mix of fuels. You're not going to have wind and rain, wind and shine every day. So you need, some amount of, other sources of energy to help you during those times. So,
and I want to make a distinction too. We talk about the energy diversification mix and the need for fossil fuels. I think it's important to know that the conversation is still responsibly produced fossil fuels as well. So we're continuing to look at lowering that CI of that product. And it's not just fossil fuel as is. We've put the wheels in motion to decarbonize fossil fuel production as well. And so it's a responsible mix of energy sources moving forward. And it's not like we're losing sight of that decarbonization narrative. We're just looking at it through a different lens with how to transition in the different sources.
Yeah, and I don't mean to sound controversial here, but some companies' tactics have been to divest of these hydrocarbon intensive assets. And sometimes to a buyer that may not have the financial wherewithal to actually be good stewards of those assets and take care of them. And that's actually part of where Talos comes in. We can be that second owner of assets and very intentionally try to take it and improve its carbon intensity. So I think we can kind of change that narrative around.
Yeah.
But it's not about just divesting. We really have to come up with real solutions and figuring out with technology how we're going to reduce, and then also we're going to have some offsetting. And so we need to establish and develop those carbon markets.
And that's a great point, because if one company divests something and somebody else runs it less well than they did, they haven't really solved the problem. They've solved the problem for themselves, but it's kind of like China running a bunch of coal-fired power plants. We can do all we want over here. If they increase their carbon output by 5x.
Yeah, it's thinking about how can we actually move the needle globally.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a debate that's been happening in the recent times. Is do you just take the ostrich approach? Where you just stick your head in the sand and then say, I'm not doing it, so it's fine, or do you partake and improve the carbon footprint of that company? Yeah. So that's a debate. There's the pluses and minuses on both sides. That's a very interesting question that you raise.
Talos has come out, and what I really like is you guys are calling yourselves the energy company of the future. Can you talk about how you're positioning yourselves as that energy company in the future and what you're thinking about there as part of this?
Yeah, it's really about balancing both. It's taking what we do day in and day out, have our expertise in, continuing to produce those very affordable, reliable, secure plentiful hydrocarbon assets, do them smarter, cheaper, and continuously to bring down that carbon intensity. But as we're building out this new low carbon business, it's really, again, focused on the end use. It's when we look at doing this as CCS as a service, we're looking at the large industrial partners in our backyard. So we're looking along the US Gulf Coast where we've got data, experience, relationships. And so we can go develop these projects, help our partners decarbonize, help them meet their sustainability goals, and also be that enabler for these new blue products, help participate in a blue or circular economy. And that's where we can really make a large impact and positive impact as we think about global sustainability goals. I mean, we can offset our emissions as a single operator, and that doesn't move the needle. But if we can help establish some of these large industrials who have several facilities and are thinking about new greenfield investment and how they can design that capture up front and even look for ways to monetize that low CI product, we want to be a part of that and help enable that. I think that's how companies can really be meaningful. Looking inside, saying, what are our skill sets, what are our advantages, and how can those play in an ever-changing energy dynamic.
Talos has come out, and what I really like is you guys are calling yourselves the energy company of the future. Can you talk about how you're positioning yourselves as that energy company in the future and what you're thinking about there as part of this?
Yeah, it's really about balancing both. It's taking what we do day in and day out, have our expertise in, continuing to produce those very affordable, reliable, secure, plentiful hydrocarbon assets, do them smarter, cheaper, and continuously to bring down that carbon intensity. But as we're building out this new low carbon business, it's really, again, focused on the end use. It's when we look at doing this as CCS as a service, we're looking at the large industrial partners in our backyard. So we're looking along the US Gulf Coast where we've got data, experience, relationships. And so we can go develop these projects, help our partners decarbonize, help them meet their sustainability goals, and also be that enabler for these new blue products, help participate in a blue or circular economy. And that's where we can really make a large impact and positive impact as we think about global sustainability goals. I mean, we can offset our emissions as a single operator, and that doesn't move the needle. But if we can help establish some of these large industrials who have several facilities and are thinking about new greenfield investment and how they can design that capture up front and even look for ways to monetize that low CI product, we want to be a part of that and help enable that. I think that's how companies can really be meaningful. Looking inside, saying, what are our skill sets, what are our advantages, and how can those play in an ever-changing energy dynamic.